Hi, I'm Alex Zhu, a longtime friend and student of Chris Langan's, whom I'll be discussing the CTMU with today. To give a bit of background about myself, I placed first in the US Math Olympiad in 2012, and many years later found myself thinking about the future of AI and its impacts on humanity. Specifically, what's going to be needed in order for AI to actually have a good impact on humanity rather than a bad one. And in the course of this thinking, I became very convinced that there's basically no way around directly confronting some core philosophical questions that have apparently vexed humanity for millennia, like what is moral goodness? After I had a spiritual awakening, I became optimistic that perhaps the mystics across the world religions may actually have some of the keys to solving these major philosophical questions. And so I embarked on a journey of trying to understand these mystical insights and translating them into a language that's sufficiently rigorous and precise for modern mathematicians and scientists to understand and appreciate them. And also for the wisdom of these mystics to actually be possible to integrate into our technology. This was an extremely daunting task, and I didn't even know if it was actually possible. I set out on this journey groping around in the dark, basically until I stumbled upon Chris's work, which felt like a revelation to me in many ways. As I engaged with Chris's work and started talking with him about it, I got the sense that he'd been on the same metaphysical journey that I was just beginning, but had actually completed it decades ago, which felt like a massive relief for me. I had a sense that one of the most challenging technical and philosophical problems facing humanity that might not even be solvable had already been solved, that most of the core ideas are online, and the guy behind the ideas are still alive and can still talk about it. Meeting Chris and encountering his work felt like a godsend. Everything I'd explored in the spiritual traditions, all the writings that I'd encountered that tried to elucidate things, whether from Buddhist metaphysics, the later writings of the physicist David Bohm, Hindu metaphysics, descriptions of near-death experiences, anything I was coming upon that felt like there was some rhyme and reason behind it that couldn't just be dismissed or brushed off, Chris was just able to effortlessly synthesize all of these into the theory that he'd already put together. As a result, my optimism for the future of humanity is now a lot higher than it was when I was just beginning this journey. And in many ways, I think of Chris as being very much like the Indian mathematician Ramanujan, who came from a very different background from that of the mainstream mathematicians at the time. And largely because of how different his background was, he was able to embark on a line of thinking using methods that were not really recognizable or comprehensible by the mainstream mathematicians at the time, to arrive at results of such depth and profundity that they still shock and inspire mathematicians today. At the same time, he initially had a lot of trouble getting people to take his work seriously just because of how far outside of the mainstream his ideas were. Fortunately for him, he got discovered by a mathematician named Hardy who'd said about Ramanujan's mathematical results, "They must be true, because if they were not true, no one would have the imagination to invent them." This kind of aesthetic sense is pretty much how I feel about Chris's work. And if I can do for Chris's work what Hardy did for Ramanujan's work, that would feel to me like a lifetime's worth of work completed under my belt. And that's part of my intention in this recording today. Chris, do you have any thoughts or comments you want to add before I continue?
Well, I'd just like to thank you for those wonderful sentiments you just expressed. You've described pretty much what the CTMU is designed to be. It's designed to tie things together, to tie the spiritual, human, religious side of reality to the scientific, mathematical side of reality, which is a problem for most people because they don't have the proper framework in which to do that. So the first thing that I tried to do was get a framework that would allow me to do that seamlessly, to actually put everything together and bundle it in such a way that it couldn't come apart, right? And of course, I had to use the idea of identities and syntactic identity operators and telic identity operators in order to do this. Basically, what I started with was the closure of reality, analytic reality closure, or the ARC principle, as it's called in the CTMU. I can express it in ordinary language. If there were anything outside of reality that were real enough to explain reality or even have relevance to reality, then it would be inside reality. Now, what I've done is I've used two words there, inside and outside. It turns out that in order to do this cohesively, in order to make sure that nothing falls apart, you've got to distinguish between intension and extension, or properties and patterns on one hand, and on the other hand, instances of those properties, what we regard as physical percepts or observations, for example. And then we've got to bundle those two things together on a very primitive level so that they can't be taken apart.
Can I make a few comments before you continue further?
Sure.
Part of my hope in this video is to basically figure out how to explain to a version of myself 3 years ago some very basic points about prerequisites for being able to directly comprehend the things that you were saying. I think I'm just going to start there right now, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Okay. I want to start by actually mentioning the Buddhist concept of emptiness, which sort of goes hand in hand with the Buddhist concept of dependent origination. I think these are basically some of the most central concepts of Mahayana Buddhism and Vajrayana Buddhism. I basically understand these concepts to mean that the idea of a thing in and of itself that can have an objective existence independent of any observer is fundamentally confused and not possible.
It's sunyata, emptiness, right?
That's right. And the opposite of emptiness basically refers to the idea of a thing having its own objective existence independent of an observer.
Having
and
a
emptiness,
self. Having a self.
Right. And
Including the
emptiness,
concept of self.
right.
Okay,
Emptiness refers to the negation of that. And dependent origination emphasizes the co-arising of any alleged thing and the observer who perceives that thing, which feels related to what you were saying earlier about the coupling between intention and extension.
Right. In the universe, everything observes everything else. So basically, this idea of dependent origination amounts to a connection of everything to everything, a big non-local connection of the universe to itself. The various parts of the universe, to recognize each other, they need to be using the same syntax and the same semantic primitives.
Yeah. And so the idea that there's sort of no such thing as a thing in and of itself seems extremely contrary to most people's intuitive metaphysics.
Contrary to Western philosophy, that's called Ding an sich.
Okay. Also, just like most people in their everyday lives sort of think of themselves as a thing and think of all the objects in their lives as things and think of the objective world as a thing. All these things are just things that are out there that somehow have their own existences. And it's a very intuitively compelling metaphysical outlook. An analogy I like to make is between this and Aristotle's observation that objects that start in motion tend to not stay in motion, which is actually the opposite of what's true, but that is a pretty good description of our intuitive physical intuitions.
Yeah, Aristotle assumed that there was an ether that actually exerted friction against things in motion so that you had to keep feeding them energy in order to keep them moving. And then Isaac, and others decided that no, really, inertial motion is distributed over everything in the universe. The thing that makes change happen is acceleration.
Right.
You shifted the emphasis from the first derivative to the second derivative, basically.
Yeah. The core thing I want to emphasize is that the negation of Aristotle's observation is actually true. Things that are in motion stay in motion by default. But when you take into account additional things like friction, that's how you can account for Aristotle's intuitive observation about the apparent nature of motion in most instances.
Yes, and of course, in this case, that connects to the assumed existence of an ether, of some kind of medium through which things move that can exert resistance or friction against them. But then we did away with ether. There was Fizeau's experiment in the mid-1800s, and then after that, there was the Michelson-Morley experiment. Michelson-Morley experiment, they had to admit that there was no motion relative to the ether that they could detect. So Einstein took that and ran with it. Einstein said, well, if there's no motion that we can detect anywhere, then basically inertial motion is not really motion at all. That's what we need the acceleration for. And then general relativity and the curvature of space-time was just applying that to accelerated coordinates in the medium itself.
A lot of that went over my head. It reminded me of a lot of science I learned in high school. The core analogy that I wanted to make, though, was between the intuition that there are things that have their own objective existence and the intuition that objects that start in motion stop being in motion by default. Both of those are wrong. In some sense, the opposites of both of them are what's actually true. And with some degree of sophistication, one can explain why one might have these wrong intuitions, even if they're not actually correct. My current, very coarse grained summary of the one of the goals of Buddhist practice is to uproot this core metaphysical error all across the depths of one's mind and psyche, which involves coming up with an understanding of how to account for the apparent existence of objectively existing things, even when, in fact, everything is codependently originated with an observer. In some sense, I think a lot of the kinds of things that Buddhists talk about become straightforwardly apparent once one has done a critical mass of correcting this core metaphysical confusion from the depths of one's mind. And I think they are basically describing a there that's there that all the religious mystics from all the different religious traditions also try to get at. But of the major world religions, I think their description of what's there is some of the most concrete and detailed. I think the CTMU is basically describing the same there that's there, except with even more rigor and detail than the Buddhists.
Well, when Eastern philosophy talks about the veil of Maya, okay, this veil of illusion, they're talking about the display of the CTMU self-simulation. The CTMU explains this in terms of it appeals to computation theory for paradigms, but then expands or extends the concept of computation to something higher. And that's how it engages with this problem of the veil of Maya and what true reality is. Okay, what samadhi and nirvana are compared to the veil of Maya.
Do you want to say a thing or two about how you understand samadhi and nirvana in the CTMU?
Samadhi is pure syntax. It's a process, a cognitive, perceptual, or identification process that is free of instances. It basically consists of metaformal syntax, which is they're couplings of properties or patterns with sets, but they all have the empty set as their set of instances. Okay, that's metaformal syntax. Because their empty set of instances is empty, that's what makes them pure syntax. So when a Buddhist achieves nirvana, he's going into the metaformal realm of the syntactic metaverse. That's totally free of instances, disengaging from reality as we know it in terms of concrete instances, and actually understanding or identifying the universe as the universe identifies itself in a primitive or primeval state, free of instantiation. Whereas now when we talk about instantiation, we're talking about something that takes place in a manifold that can assign separate positions, separate states to the instances in question so that they can be distinguished one from another, so that the Pauli exclusion principle can distinguish. So that's the physical part of reality. The instances are the physical, whereas the syntactic primitives that we're talking about, that's the mental. So you put the physical side and the mental side together in the form of the terminal and non-terminal realms of the CTMU.
Chris, did you experience this yourself when you first figured out the CTMU?
Well, I always instinctively understood it. It's just been, you know how you feel, okay, I understand that, not a problem for me, but then you have a hard time explaining it to anybody else. So you've got to start dissecting it. You've got to start taking it apart into its constituent concept. This is something that it took me a long time to do. I had to figure out what it was that was missing from other people's minds and intuitions that made it so hard for them to understand my intuition about these things. So that's what drove me. It's just the idea, okay, I've got to actually communicate this more effectively to others, and I can't lose anything by communicating it more effectively to myself while I'm at it. So this is what I've got to do, break it down and actually come up with all the parts and the entire myriology that you need in order to make this work. That's what other people get. They hit a certain brick wall. They hit a brick wall there. They can't get past the instances, and that's where they stop. That's where it stops for them. So they think that the entire world is physical. Reality is completely physical. The mind supervenes on the physical part of reality, and it's all about physical reality for them.
Can I just chime in with another thought there?
Sure.
Okay, yeah. Part of, as you just said, Chris, part of the standard scientific worldview sort of takes for granted the existence of the physical universe as a thing in and of itself. It takes for granted the laws of physics as things in and of themselves. It takes for granted the initial conditions of the universe as being
Precisely. And it's
stated
not
above
allowed to do that.
themselves.
Yeah, it's
Right.
not allowed.
So, right, yeah, I think part of it doesn't really make sense to ask of Buddhist metaphysics to account for physics in the way that we managed to understand physics in the 20th century. But physics, as we understand it, is based on very shaky metaphysical foundations that the Buddhists are well aware of. Like, they're well aware of how shaky those foundations are. And I think there's sort of a question of what do you get when you take physics as we understand it, but fix the metaphysical foundations that it's based off of? What's the end result? What does that look like?
Well,
And
yeah.
that I think of as what the CTMU is largely trying to be about. Also, if you take logic or math and take the metaphysical foundations that the mainstream mathematicians, logicians are using and
Then you
fix
get
those.
metalogic and metamathematics, right?
Yeah.
And then you have to put that metalogic and metamathematics together with the meta-empirical side, the metaphysical side of reality in one overall language, and then you have your TOE. It's as simple as that. Then you've got a unified description of reality. The CTMU is about how to do that.
Yeah.
Now, there are a lot of people who claim, well, that's meaningless and that's gobbledygook, that's blah, blah, blah. Those people are full of it.
Can I
It's
speak to that,
absolutely
Chris?
necessary. Go ahead.
I think a lot of deep Buddhist metaphysics, I think, is very hard to understand for most people because of how deeply entrenched their metaphysical confusions are in such a way that leads them to sort of persistently misinterpret the details of what the Buddhists are actually trying to say.
Precisely.
And
They're at once dualists and non-dualists. And they use non-duality in a term in a way that Western mathematicians don't use it. But basically, they are at once dualists. They separate Maya from, nirvana. These are two different sides of reality, two different things. Whereas they call themselves non-dualists and say, no, those all have to be put together in the base state, the ontic ground state of the universe, or Brahman if they're Hindus, and it all comes from the same tradition, of course. So that's the paradox of Asian philosophy, dualism versus non-dualism. You've got to unpack those things consistently with each other, and that hasn't yet been done.
well, you did it, right?
Yes, I did it. Yeah, that's the CTMU.
It's very plausible to me that some Buddhist lineages carry an embodied understanding of this kind of untangling, and they have done it, but
There's a lot of intuition there. I mean, Buddhism is full of good intuition, and you've got to respect there's a lot of philosophy there, and the guys doing that philosophizing were not dummies. They had very good intuition, but there were just some things missing, conceptual structure that was missing that they needed.
Right. Like they also didn't have like the mathematical, scientific, and logical tools that you had.
Precisely. Precisely.
Yeah.
I mean, living in this time it's a little bit of a luxury because some very intelligent people have invented a lot of these tools. And now we can make use of them, whereas the philosophers of yore could not.
That's right. And so, yeah, there's another way that now think about what the CTMU is, which is it's a description of the metaphysical a priori, in that when you correct these core, deeply entrenched metaphysical errors, and then just ask, what are the metaphysical primitives that must exist and how must they interrelate in order for me to even be here reasoning about these questions at all in the first place? The CTMU is an answer to that question.
That's correct. And basically what it says is you don't have a fundamental distinction between the a priori and the a posteriori in the first place. You've got to put them together. You've got to put them together. And that is your fundamental reality.
Mm-hmm.
You can never take them apart completely. It's an evolutionary process whereby an identity simply self-differentiates as it evolves. And it starts with this one unified metasubstance or ontic ground state, which in the CTMU is called telesis.
Right. One thing that people who don't get the CTMU often remark is that it seems very complicated, like it has lots of moving parts.
It is its simplest and most elegant theory in existence.
Right. I think my response to that is that it actually has Kolmogorov complexity 0. The analogy I make is with the fine-tuning constant, where on the one hand, it seems like that constant seems set so precisely in a way that enables life that it feels kind of mysterious and arbitrary on some level. That level is the wrong vantage frame from which to be thinking about it, because from the fact that you're here to even think about it at all, it has to be set in such a way that you can.
Precisely, according to dependent origination. It is a function of everything else in the universe. So in evolving, because the universe distributes its nature over everything, that constant and other constants of nature naturally emerge.
Right. And the analogy I want to make is between the intricate precision of the fine-tuning constants and the intricate precision of the CTMU, where that it's not a bunch of arbitrary details strung together. It's sort of the
It's
minimal
the
set
opposite of that.
of right, exactly. The minimal set of philosophical primitives you need to even wonder about whether the CTMU can make sense in the first place.
Right. Well, the CTMU does make sense in the first place. If nothing else
Yeah.
makes sense, it does. But the CTMU is precisely what you need to understand how reality, the reality that we live in and share with each other, how that makes sense. The CTMU explains that by putting everything together in one unified identity and then describing how that identity evolves without ever losing coherence. It maintains its coherence from the alpha to the omega. We've had many of these discussions before, and I've explained to you how that happened. We have to requantize things metaformally, replace events with meta-events, replace ordinary points of space with syntactic or identity operators. Thusly, we've got different states. This concept of state is different, and the concept of event is different. And once we adjust those accordingly, then we can make the universe, the global identity of reality, we can make it evolve in the way that I'm talking, coherently.
Yeah. This brings me to one of the core insights I picked up from talking with you, Chris, about the CTMU concerning the nature of mind and matter and how they interrelate, where the mainstream scientific worldview says matter is fundamental and everything else just supervenes on top. And then you have some idealists that say, no, mind is fundamental. Everything apparently material is just perceived within. And one thing I picked up from engaging with the CTMU was the idea that matter depends on mind and mind depends on matter.
Very good.
And it might appear on the outset that this leads to an infinite regress or circular logic of some sort. And that was something that used to trip me up until I realized that this sort of self-reference could instead just mean that the structures at hand are self-similar, like a fractal or hologram.
Right.
And yeah.
And the reality is logically idempotent. It basically returns itself as a product. Every operation that occurs in its evolution returns identities as identities. It's called idempotence, and the same thing works in the opposite direction. No matter how far you want to regress, if you want to regress further, you have to apply the same syntax to itself over again. That's what idempotence is, or idempotence, depending on how you pronounce it. I'm not in academia, so I don't know how they pronounce things. I pronounce them my own way.
Makes sense. One friend of mine says something to the effect of, yeah, the intuition behind the axiom of foundation in Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, that basically you can't have like an infinitely descending object where that's like a set that contains a set that contains a set where it never bottoms out. That intuition is false. And that also felt like it helped me click something.
Well, yeah, it means that you have no start and no end point, because basically it's infinite on both ends. And if you have no start and no end point, you have no identity. Basically, causation boils down to relationships between starting points and end points. So if you can't call a starting point and end point to reality as a whole, then you can't do it to the quanta of reality either. The whole thing falls apart.
Yeah. And one more comment is that I feel like the intuition behind the axiom of foundation of like really wanting a solid foundation from which everything can get built up, I think sort of flies in the face of emptiness and dependent origination, because that foundation that we want to have just exist and have everything lean on would be non-empty by its very nature.
That's exactly right. It starts and ends as a coupling of pattern or property and its instances. There's no separating the two. And that's why when Asian philosophy talks about non-duality to a Westerner, that's actually more properly stated non-dualism. That's why it's ironic that they claim to be non-dualists, and yet here they are distinguishing between Maya and the world of final events that we're immersed in here, and this ultimate reality, this Arctic ground state that you get to when you attain nirvana.
Mm-hmm. Just for clarity for some listeners, Chris, you're making a sharp distinction between dualism here, as in Cartesian dualism, and duality, as in the mathematical notion.
Correct. These terms are widely misconstrued because Some Asian philosophers use them differently. They use the word non-duality when, according to a Western philosopher, they should be using the term non-dualism. Okay? In other words, if the idea is to get rid of mind-body dualism, Cartesian dualism, that's non-dualism. An Asian philosopher says, well, we can do that. We can get rid of dualism and have non-dualism using non-duality. That doesn't make any sense because dualism and duality have two separate meanings. In science, mathematics, duality means something entirely different.
Right. I want to go back to this bit about the mental and the matter mutually depending on each other in a self-referential way, strange loop-like in Douglas Hofstadter's language that avoids infinite regress. I think of cells as good illustrations of this kind of strange type signature where the hardware level and the software level of a cell can't be cleanly delineated, and cells reproduce themselves and are capable of both interpreting their material aspects as information and using that information to guide their own material processing.
Right. Well, where the interpretation, that's not a conscious thing on the part of the cell. The cell is performing that automatically with a certain amount of autonomy, to which there are limits. It gets a certain amount of autonomy in performing this interpretative self-modeling. In the CTMU, that's called self-modeling action. And then it's got to tie into the whole organism and obey the constraints that surround it, having to do with the other cells in the organism. And so it's got a mixture of freedom and constraint, autonomy and non-autonomy.
Yeah, I think the next thing I want to talk about is how the CTMU relates to the Tegmark 4 mathematical universe hypothesis. I used to find the mathematical universe hypothesis very compelling in that, in some sense, it's sort of just saying, consider the space of all tautologies. In some ways, this is like the space of all mathematical structures. They must all exist because they're all tautologies. Among these mathematical structures, which must tautologically exist, are the mathematical structures corresponding to our physical universes. Therefore, physical universes must exist because they must have mathematical existence because all possible mathematical structures must exist. And that's why we're here and we exist, and this is the nature of existence.
Where does Max come up with that? Is that an assumption that Max is making, or does Max derive that from something else?
What I wanted to say is that there's something mathematically Platonist about this, which I used to not take issue with.
Precisely.
Because I wasn't as sensitive to mathematical Platonism posits the objective independent existence of mathematical objects, which are non-empty. And if I take the concept of the mathematical universe and correct its metaphysical foundations, where there's no such thing as a Platonic mathematical object anymore, and everything is dependently arising, I think that's basically what the CTMU is trying to describe. It's like,
yes.
if you consider what the space of all tautologies is, but when you have that correct metaphysical foundations, what is its structure? What can you say about it?
Okay, exactly. And remember, the CTMU is quantized in terms of identity operators. An identity is a tautology, and a tautology is an identity. Intension and extension are actually reinforcing each other. They're coupled there. The tautology itself can take itself as a sentential variable, for example. As a sentential variable, it is an instance of itself. So basically, we're talking about identity operators when we're talking about tautologies. Technically, in the CTMU, the term is metatautology. When you have a comprehensive metatautology, you have a supertautology. The CTMU is a supertautology that perfectly couples intension and extension on a primitive level. And because it does that, it is unbreakable. It is the only reliable description of reality that there is. That's the point of the CTMU. We need a reliable description of reality to survive, to determine our relationship to reality, what we are and how we relate to the rest of reality. That's the name of the game in survival. So that's what we're trying to do with the CTMU. That's what we've done. If I can ever pound it into the heads of the those who can't understand the first word.
Following from that, the CTMU implies that there's kind of a circular dependency between the possible universes, material universes that can exist, and the possible observers that could exist. Because
That's right.
the universe can only be real if it's perceived by an observer, but an observer can only be real if it's instantiated.
Included by topologically included in the universe, correct.
Okay.
And that's why
Yeah.
we say that the universe topologically includes the secondary teller, or the observer, and the observer descriptively contains the universe. In other words, we've got topological and descriptional or expressive senses of containment or inclusion. That's why there's this sense of dual inclusion in the CTMU.
Right. The idea that material existence requires an observer as a prerequisite is pretty central to John Wheeler's conception of the it from bit idea.
Right. We like to say, okay, well, it's integral to this or it's basic to that. But the fact of the matter is, none of this was fully explicated until the CTMU. You need this super tautological linguistic structure, intrinsic language structure, in order to actually explain what's happening there. Wheeler intuited this, but, he only took it so far.
Yeah. Chris, I'd like to return to some of the mutual dependence of universes and observers.
Okay.
So my understanding is that because of this dependence, it's not the case that every possible conceivable universe does exist. It's only the subset of those that get observed that can exist.
All of the ones that could generate enough self-utility to make it worth their while to exist.
Right. I think this is related to the Telek principle, like this mutual dependency between possible universes and possible observers.
Right.
And how they require each other to exist.
Yes.
And so part of my understanding about what's wrong with many worlds is that the sort of which branch of the wave function you find yourself on is actually constrained by anthropics, and in particular the Telek principle. And it's not the case that all these different branches can somehow just have their own existences. Because
no, that would be a linear ectomorphic reality. All these branches that you're talking about are lines. They're trajectories of particles through space. Those don't exist. That's not the form in which the universe exists. All of those are retrodicted,
right? Yeah.
They're retrodicted, yes.
Right. My understanding is that in the CTMU, how the wave function collapses from your perspective, it's not like every single possibility is just happening out there. All but one of those possibilities gets pruned away according to the Telek principle. Is that right?
That's correct. Basically, they need telons. There have to be telons that are actively acquiring resources from the environment and putting them together in patterns of events. Without that, nothing is determined. You need to requantize causation in terms of metacausal telons, which are the configurations of tellers.
Right. One of the big sticking points for me for the CTMU at first was in my physicalist intuitions were just very, very deeply entrenched of thinking that my mind was nothing but stuff that was emergent from matter. But there came a shift for me one day when I realized that a lot of the initial conditions might still not be determined. And it's possible for my mental choices to actually influence what the initial conditions are. And Scott Aronson actually wrote a paper speculating about this possibility around 10 years ago, where he was basically just like, yeah, it does actually seem consistent with the laws of physics for human beings like us to have free will that operate by influencing the initial conditions of the universe.
Right. What Scott neglected to say was that the CTMU has been saying that for a lot longer than he did. I mean,
Yes.
This has been built into the CTMU from Jump Street. The fact of the matter is, while they're willing to listen to this from Scott Aronson for some reason, they're not willing to listen to it from the CTMU. This is a very big mistake because whatever Scott's paper said, it's not as good as what I've said in the CTMU. And
Yeah,
that's a fact.
I'm not making that.
I'll guarantee that without even having read
This is just for the
Scott's
listeners.
paper. Yeah, okay.
Yes.
And by the way, Scott Aronson, as I recall, actually wrote back when, near the turn of the millennium, when there was a lot of publicity on me, he actually wrote a kind of a nice blog post about me at that point. So Scott Aronson was one of the people who got on my good side back then. But he still didn't understand enough about the CTMU, apparently, to know that that's what he was talking about when he wrote this paper you mentioned.
Yeah.
That's basically the story of the CTMU. Nobody understands diddly. So they think they're discovering all of these things from scratch. All of these things were discovered and put together decades ago.
Mm-hmm.
All right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Continue with my previous thread. I had a realization that there was room for our minds to influence the initial conditions, and there was also room for our minds to influence how the wave function collapses. I think John Wheeler even wrote about a possibility to this effect in one of his writings about observer participancy in the universe, where he was just like, yeah, physics basically just doesn't have anything to say about how the wave function collapses.
Right, right. He called that
And
law without law, right?
okay, yeah.
When you talk about
And
the initial conditions of the universe, right?
there's the initial conditions and there's also how the wave function collapses. And part of my understanding, Chris, is that under your models, observers like us actually have a crucial role in shaping how the wave function collapses.
That's correct. Without secondary tellers, there is no way for the universe to fully determine itself, to fully determine its own evolution. We're like the local sensor controllers, is how that's put in the CTMU, that actually determine events as they locally occur. The laws of physics underdetermine reality. They're invariant. Okay, they apply to everything. They apply to all instances, no matter what those instances are. It follows that they do not fully determine those instances. They alone do not. You need states. You need to actually specify the inputs, the input data, the states themselves, in order to get exact results out of those laws. We're the ones who actually determine the exact states as they appear and have those laws applied to them. And the laws are only valid retrodictively. Basically, there's symmetry conditions. They're just basically derived from the symmetries of the display of the reality self-simulation. Everything is generated, telecally generated.
Right. I'm mostly sharing these sort of cracks in the scientific worldview as things that sort of liberated me from my deeply entrenched physicalist intuitions and made it a lot more possible for me to actually see a lot of the structure that you were
Right,
talking
right. A
about.
physicalist believes that mind emerges from matter. From what the hell does matter emerge? Okay, that's all you need to ask yourself in order to kind of get over that physicalism thing. All right? Physics needs to explain itself. Science is about explanation. If physics cannot explain itself, it's not a theory of reality. It's something less. And that is true on its face. That's self-evident. I don't need to say one more thing about it. Physics cannot explain where physics came from. Where did those laws come from? According to Wheeler, they came from some kind of state that is characterized by law without law. There's some sort of a primordial state from which those things can arise. That's called telesis in the CTMU. And we can go and we can start naming the properties of telesis, what it is, what it does, how it evolves. And the CTMU enumerates the properties that telesis must have for this to happen and how that actually occurs. This kind of, resonates with what a lot of people are saying now. What is very frustrating to me is that I've been saying all of those things for a long time. In 1989, when I had the first detailed application of the simulation hypothesis, number one, first, then it was all new. But they stared at it, they blinked, they drooled, and then they decided to keep it to themselves and never mention it. Why? Because there were trolls out there that would call it intelligent design creationism. We don't want to be associated with that. Well, that would be the end of our academic career. So we just won't mention the CTMU and we won't mention Chris Langan. Okay?
I actually want to also now talk about how the CTMU opened me up to an intelligent version of intelligent design. And I'm also hoping to introduce the concept of metatime here for some of our listeners. I remembered at some point coming up with an analogy of, in the standard physicalist conception of the universe, the initial conditions are all fixed. And then with a deterministic application of the laws of physics, or a probabilistically deterministic application, you can compute the next state and the next state.
Well,
and so
yeah,
on and so
exactly.
forth.
How did they get fixed in the
It's a
first place?
clockwork universe.
Yeah, so how did they get fixed in the first place?
Right. And I was considering a different possibility of like, oh wait, what if the universe is more like a story that's getting written and it's still in the process of getting written, where like different portions of the story are fleshed out in different orders, and the different portions all have to be able to come together in a mutually consistent way eventually. And the orders in which things get fleshed out is very different from the order of linear time in which the story actually progresses sequentially.
Exactly. Very good.
Right. And so this idea of the order in which the story gets its details fleshed out, I more or less corresponds to the concept of metatime as I understand it in the CTMU. Does that sound right, Chris?
Yes, it does. Basically, you can understand the difference between time and metatime by using a computational analogy, which the CTMU uses these analogies fairly regularly. You've got a programmer, and the programmer is writing his program in time. Then you've got the runtime of the program itself. You can compare that programming, that sense of programming time, whereby the processor distributes the program to what's going on the display of the computer. That's how metatime relates to time. how the processor relates to the display. We can imagine that the processor is self-programming. If there's a programmer locked in there, he's doing his programming. He does that in time. That distributes directly down to the display. What you see happening in the display, that's locked in the display. You don't see what's happening in the processor. All you're seeing is what's happening on the display. This has to be generalized. This is just a computational analogy. And what's happening in the CTMU happens on a level above or beyond that.
And am I also right that in the CTMU, details of the story getting fleshed out is what consciousness is? Like progressing through metatime is what consciousness is?
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
Okay.
Consciousness is a property of the global identity that is distributed to everything that happens in the identity, including the display. That display is immersed in the processor, right? The processor and the display are not two completely separate things, but they're actually coupled to each other. A human being, a secondary teller, exists in both. You have the body of Alex Zhu that exists in the display, but you extend, you're a secondary teller that extends into the non-terminal display. So that's what you're doing. Your consciousness is basically distributing. There is a terminal consciousness, right? You experience these thoughts. It's experience itself that we're talking about here. We're not talking about the thoughts. The thoughts can actually be injected in your head, subconscious, from the non-terminal domain. But that part of you which exists in the display and is conscious of your environment in the display, that's terminal consciousness. So in other words, there's an extended form of consciousness that exists in the CTMU that is inherited from the identity of reality. And then there's your terminal consciousness, which is very localized.
Mm-hmm.
That localized
and on your model, the brain is sort of an antenna for the non-terminal consciousness.
That's correct. You've heard me use that word antenna a lot. And of course, that the antenna concept, that has to be qualified. It's not like an ordinary antenna that is just responding to oscillations in the electric field or something like that. It's actually a more complex process than that. And this is something that we'll discuss in the future, I suppose.
Going back to the analogy of reality getting authored, this sort of invites the question of who the author of the story is. And my understanding of the CTMU is that the author and the story are one. They're two sides of the same coin. And that this parallels a self-authoring story and a reality self-simulation, I think, are basically just two ways of saying the same thing.
That's correct. There are as many narratives as there are secondary tellers, as many programs as there are secondary tellers. Each secondary teller represents a set of possible futures, not a set. You know, we said there are not these discrete choices that can be made. Those don't actually exist. They have to be generated. But there's a discrete identity of possible futures that is associated with each and every secondary teller.
Right.
And the idea is to make all of those come together in one unified reality.
Right. And this also sort of like opened me up to the idea of a sort of intelligent designer that isn't, it's importantly not a creator God that's separate from us and just twiddling the details around according to how it wants things to go. But we are the constituents of this God in the same sort of way that ourselves are the constituents of us.
Correct. And it's trying to make us all happy. And unfortunately, we're not cooperating. Otherwise, this would be the best of all possible worlds. But people, they have the wrong idea about what reality is supposed to be. They think, well, reality is supposed to be where I get everything I want. I can do anything to get there, and to hell with other people. Okay, that's not the way it works. That leads to a pathological reality of the kind in which we're immersed right now, where you've got this fattening oligarchy that gets richer and richer and fatter, while everybody else loses their homes and their jobs and their cars, you see.
Yeah, this is a good segue to some questions I wanted to ask you about the life review. One thing that I found striking about my conversations with you, Chris, was how adeptly and straightforwardly you were able to answer my questions about near-death experiences. And my understanding is basically, based off our conversations, Chris, that when someone has a near-death experience, their immersion in the terminal realm ceases. And basically what's happening is they're getting a glimpse of non-terminal reality. In some sense, everything that had been happening all along that they had been filtering out because of their immersion in their physical bodies. Does that sound accurate?
Well, I'm not quite sure about the
How would
meaning
you
of everything.
correct that? Oh, okay. How would you say it?
Well, basically, as I say, as a secondary teller, you exist in both the display and the processor. When your physical life ends, you remain embedded in the display, in the underlying layers of the display, which are the extended superposition of the conspansive manifold. Okay? You're down in there. Now, the question is, are you trapped in the layered states of your body as they existed throughout time, or can you go elsewhere? Can you be put into another reality? To be put into another reality, in other words, to form a new set of instances for your invariant identity, you will need to be retracted into the syntactic metaverse of primitives. And then another body will be created for you in an alternate realm, be it heaven, be it hell, be it another universe. Doesn't make any difference. The mechanics are the same.
That's the case for all beings, like all secondary tellers, right? Including like lizards.
Lizards are secondary tellers. Even plants are secondary tellers. The thing is, can the secondary teller maintain its personal identity? Is there enough that distinguishes it from other secondary tellers of its kind so that it is actually separately reincarnated? And the fact of the matter is, no. A lot of these identities get mixed together. They come together and then are redistributed to, reality in combination thereof. Human identity can be mixed in the same way. But there's a safeguard here, and that is that the engine of retraction, which is the global identity, will reject anything that cannot be safely combined with everything else. It has to. Otherwise, it ends up killing itself. And if there's one thing that the global identity is not going to do, it's let itself be destroyed by absorbing things that are inconsistent with its nature. So if someone is judged or is recognized or identified to be inconsistent with the nature of the global identity, it is barred or blocked from retraction. It is effectively trapped in the conspansive manifold.
Importantly, they're in some sense trapping themselves and making that choice for themselves.
Well, precisely, yes.
Yeah. Part of my understanding of the CTMU is that it implies that pretty much everyone experiences a life review when they die. Like the process of death can't be completed without a review of everything in your life that you might not have paid attention to as you were living your life.
Right, and you basically are subjecting yourself to that review in conjunction with other parts of your stratified identity. In other words, you're being retracted to higher levels of identity in which other secondary tellers play a part, or higher entities that are not physically actualized, but this is what the theory of karmic actualization is all about. In these life reviews, there are like boards of judgment, right? Groups of assessors that actually help you judge yourself. These are all present at higher levels of identity. But you are always involved. You are always implicit in those higher levels of identity. So basically, you're judging yourself. You know what you've done in your life. Nobody else can be totally sure of it, but you know what you've done. If you're a serial killer, for example, you're going to know about it. There is no concealing this from yourself. And that is basically who's judging you, yourself. It knows your experience perfectly. And it's going to decide whether or not you are consistent with its nature, whether your lower stratum of identity is consistent with the higher level of stratified identity that is actually judging you. You see? And if you're not consistent, then that's it. Okay? Most people, it's a terrible thing. People don't understand this anymore. They used to. It used to be, well, do what God wants or you're going to hell. And they took that for granted. And then you had a bunch of people saying, oh, no, there is no hell. There is no answering for anything. Anything you can get away with here is just fine. Not exactly. That's not the way it works. There is a cost associated with being an evil person. And unfortunately, there are a lot of evil people in the world today. We want to let them know what they're doing to themselves. And if we can, then everybody will behave themselves and we'll live in the best of all possible worlds, as created for us by God.
And so it sort of sounds like part of what you're saying here is that the CTMU implies that everyone's going to be accountable for everything they've done. And the mere fact that we might be dissociating from or hiding from ourselves what we've done while we're alive doesn't mean that we can escape them when we die.
Right. When you're retracted, your avenues of escape are gone. You can't use psychological suppression mechanisms anymore to avoid seeing who you are and what you've done. Okay? All that's going to be revealed. Your psychological suppression mechanisms are going to go away. They have to in order to get you retracted to a higher level of your own identity. So there's no escape.
Yeah, I remember one comment you made that really stuck with me is that the life review is happening right now already.
That's correct. Meta-simultaneity, right?
Yeah. that really struck me and made some things make sense. Because before I was thinking of it as a particular experience one has at the end of their life that's generated by their brain. And that just never really made sense to me.
It's not generated by your brain. It's generated by your higher levels of identity. And your brain is no longer constraining you and locking you into terminal consciousness. So your consciousness is becoming generalized to higher levels of identity. And that's the consciousness that is reading you and judging you, that is subjecting your life to review.
Yeah, there's the image that sort of comes to mind is there's a thread that winds around itself and gets knotted and shaped over the course of your life. And when you die, all of the mechanisms that are keeping the thread taut sort of come loose, and there's just sort of this big unraveling where your whole life is sort of meta simultaneously re-experienced, but without any of the filtration mechanisms that your brain was using to filter out.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
And so the life review isn't generated. It's sort of like, it's the result of the subtraction of all of your brain's filtration mechanisms.
Precisely.
Which happens when the brain stops functioning.
Right. It's a function of what we call retraction. Right. Exactly. And there's no avoiding it.
Yeah. When people ask me, hey, Alex, it sounds like you think the religions are all kind of saying the same thing. There are all these differences. What do you think is the thing they have in common? And the thing that comes up for me is they basically all say that you should live as though you're going to experience a life review because you actually are going to experience one.
As a matter of fact, are experiencing it right now. Okay, given the existence of meta-simultaneity and how meta-time relates to time.
Right. I'm reminded of some sophisticated interpretations of Catholic doctrine that say that heaven and hell are separate places, but they're states of the soul that we're inhabiting right now, whether we're aware of it or not.
Yes, I would agree with that.
One particularly interesting aspect of the life review is that you're not just re-experiencing the details of your own life in high resolution, you're also experiencing how everyone else's experiences, and in particular, the joys and sufferings that you've caused others. And so it's sort of saying, like, you shouldn't just live by the golden rule because you're supposed to, but you're going to reap the consequences, whether good and bad, of all the times you've lived in accordance with or not with the golden rule. Right.
Nobody's perfect. We're all gonna screw up. The thing is, you don't want to screw up so badly that you become unretractable, that you can no longer be reinstantiated. You lose access to the other incarnations in which your identity has been involved.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of incarnations, another metaphysical liberation that the CTMU facilitated for me was that I previously always sort of thought of my incarnation as being determined by or constrained by the details of my parents' lives and how they met and how they conceived me.
Mm-hmm.
And then I basically just had a realization that I might have come earlier in Metatime than a lot of the details of my parents' lives. It might have already been determined in God's mind, so to speak, some high-level details of my life. And then details of my parents' lives might have gotten filled in afterwards to arrange for the details of my own life coming into being.
Right. There has to be agreement between your telesis and the procreative telesis of your parents. That's what determines to whom you are born. Ideally, that's true.
Yeah.
Some people appear to be born by accident. They get born into the world and they hate their parents because I didn't want to be here. I didn't ask to be here. Okay. This has nothing to do with me. I'm going to check out, or I'm going to, do whatever I want to because I'm not responsible for anything that happens because I didn't sign on for this. That is not allowed. There is always a sense in which you are implicated in your own birth, in your own generation.
Right. This understanding also made Ian Stevenson's collected reports of children who remember past lives feel like it had more solid metaphysical grounding. Like the CTMU basically, as I understand it, allows for a metaphysical realm where people, like before beings are incarnated, they can give themselves reminders of unfinished business from past lives and have that be a prior constraint on the future lives they're going to live, which might then in turn retrodict the events leading up to their birth and their childhood such that they come together in a way such that they might have certain memories or have certain skills or have certain birthmarks that are reminiscent of their previous lives. Is that right, Chris?
That's pretty much as we discussed it, yes.
Great. The last thing I want to touch on before we wrap up is the idea of the CTMU as a meta religion. So, not as its own new separate religion, but as a translation layer that captures and distills the essences of the existing religions, so that rather than getting into conflicts over dogma and interpretations of not fully precise concepts, have a Rosetta Stone that can translate between the really central core ideas that are shared across all the religions and also with the world of science.
Precisely. It's a common framework in which you can interpret or model the scripture of all religions. You have to. For the religions to be valid, you've got to be able to put it into a model of reality. So that's what we're doing. We're mapping all of those disparate religions into one common framework, which is a model of reality, how reality models itself. And once we do that, then we can achieve agreement among the various religions and put an end to a lot of the religious conflict that pointlessly exists throughout history.
In addition, the scientific worldview recognizes that it has a bunch of holes. Like, it recognizes that they don't understand quantum foundations. They recognize that they don't understand anthropics. They recognize they don't really have a good answer for where the laws of physics come from or how to even think about that. They recognize to some extent that there's a lot around consciousness that doesn't seem to be adequately accounted for by their worldview. And the CTMU also transcends and includes all that's good about the scientific worldview.
Well, basically that scientific worldview is predicated on ignorance of the CTMU. That scientific perspective that you're talking about, okay, well, we understand that we've got problems with this and understand that we've got problems with that. Basically what they say is, well, yes, nobody understands these things yet, but we're working on it. Well, that's BS. There's some people do understand what the problems are and do understand what's going on. It's just that the scientific community won't listen, won't direct their attention in the proper direction.
Right. And for that matter, my own experience thinking about these problems myself is that to make any serious progress on them, you have to step so far outside of what's commonly accepted within the standard scientific paradigm that you're basically going to get branded as crazy. But by the time you start having any interesting real insights about what could actually answer those questions, and then you have to step even further than that in order to actually have everything tied together in a coherent way.
Right. That's something that is not within the purview of any scientist. Scientists are not trained to reason in that way.
Right. And so from a sociological standpoint, that sort of kind of makes sense to me that one guy, you, with an IQ way higher than mine, just trying on his own to figure things out without any of the constraints of scientific acceptability or reputability, was able to do it. Given that mystics in the past have uncovered similar insights, it's really not that a priori implausible that you would too, just with the help and benefit of scientific and mathematic language and precision. From the mainstream intellectual perspective, figuring out a rigorous and precise theory of everything sounds totally implausible. Whereas from the mystics' perspective, they've gotten glimpses of it throughout the millennia. And you, Chris, have also gotten a glimpse of it, but you've also managed to put it on solid intellectual foundations. And so It's there not just as a glimpse, but as an understanding that you can communicate about.
Precisely. I've been a little bit more analytic about it. I've actually subjected it to analysis and tried to tie things together more. It's not that other people haven't had similar insights. The CTMU has roots that go way back in history and a long tradition of philosophers trying to figure out what makes reality tick. But it differs in the sense that I've actually assigned an overall mathematical structure to everything, which is something that has not been done before. That's what's different about the CTMU. And when scientists talk about solving these big problems that science itself can't solve, this is where they're going to have to go to do it. And they keep on pretending that it hasn't been done yet, but it has been done.
Right. And
they need to admit it.
Some closing thoughts here. Right now, the world is starving for a new worldview that can transcend and include all the existing ones, which are currently at war with each other and fracturing into parts that are themselves at war with each other. And people are increasingly recognizing that that's not sustainable. And I think the CTMU can lay the foundations for such a worldview, which is why I felt so excited when I discovered it. And I'm so grateful for Chris for putting in the work to pursue it and figure it out and spend decades trying to share it to a society that wasn't capable of valuing it for what it was.
Well, thank you so much. At least I'm appreciated by somebody. And believe you me, I feel very appreciative of the attention that you're giving the CTMU and your insights as expressed in this program. So thank you very much, Alex. And we'll get together again soon.
Yep. Take care.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.